If you found yourself digging through the waiver wire after week 1, you may have found a few players that you could have utilized in your lineup right away. And with a couple of key injuries in week 2, now it's time to decide if we can find those same type of players heading into week 3. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Kyle back with the Fantasy Headliners and our Week 3 waiver wire video. I've got several guys at the running back, wide receiver, and tight end position that we may be able to utilize on our roster, not only in Week 3, but moving forward. And then I've got a couple of options at quarterback and defensive special teams that if you're looking to stream this week, you could definitely utilize them in your lineup. And also, I'm going to have a few players at the end of the video that we probably should just cut ties with at this point, or we should be expecting to very soon. And one other quick note on the video, I don't put these players in any particular order. I'm just trying to give you as much information as possible. So then you can go back to your league, take a look at your league settings and team management, and try to decide which one of these players are going to be the best for you moving forward. Now, if you have questions on whether or not you should drop or add somebody, leave those in the comments and I'll let you know which one may be best for you. All right, let's kick it off at the running back position now. Is it Alexander Madison's fault that he's looked so poor to start the season? Absolutely not. Some offensive line, some play calling, a few other things here and there. But that doesn't mean that the Minnesota Vikings may not try to give Ty Chandler more touches coming up soon. He only had 1 carry this past week on Thursday Night Football, so him taking over the backfield doesn't look imminent. But if you have Alexander Madison, or if you have a deeper bench or deeper rosters, I definitely would consider adding him before he becomes a top priority if he were to take over or at least split 50-50 anytime coming up. Gus Edwards and Justice Hill were both priority adds last week at the running back position, and even in that video last week, I told you all that my pick would have been Gus Edwards, and he is the guy that had a much better performance this past Sunday. Now, Justice Hill did get 1 more carry, and he had 3 targets and caught all 3 of those in the passing game. It was Gus Edwards who was the most efficient, as usual, and also ran for a touchdown. As I explained last week, Gus Edwards is going to be the guy in between the 20s. Justice Hill is probably going to see some work at the goal line, and we'll see some work in pass downs as well. But for me, if I'm the guy that's saying I need to pick one of these players to fill in on a roster spot for me, I'm 100% going with Gus Edwards over Justice Hill. For Zach Moss at the beginning of the week, there was even a few questions on whether or not he would play this coming week. Later in the week, he ended up being added to the depth chart, number 1 overall, and it looked like he was going to take over the backfield. Now, one thing I want to caution everybody on, did Zach Moss have a good day? Absolutely. But keep in mind that Anthony Richardson missed a majority of the game after scoring 2 rushing touchdowns and completing 6 of his 10 passes. That could have had something to do with the workload and work type that Zach Moss got. Now, Anthony Richardson's still in the concussion protocol right now, and we'll have to keep an eye on that throughout the week. But if Anthony Richardson is going to be on the field with Zach Moss, he probably isn't going to have the same type of ceiling that we saw from him this past week. For the second straight week, I'm including Roschon Johnson on here, and he is a guy that we talked about this offseason as well. Has he taken over the backfield as a lot of Johnson truthers said was going to happen already? Absolutely not. But one big step we saw this past week was seeing Dante Foreman become a healthy inactive. It made sure that Roschon Johnson, at worst, was the number 2. Now, was he more efficient than Khalil Herbert this past week? Absolutely. But Khalil Herbert still averaged over 5 yards a carry himself. He still saw work in the passing game. He was still the starting running back, and he was still used in the red zone as well. Roschon Johnson isn't taking over right now. Herbert hasn't really done anything to lose the job because this offense as a whole hasn't really been that great. We'll continue to eye it, but he really might be that next guy up when you take a look at backups that could overtake the starter. I included Kyren Williams last week on the waiver wire video, and if you were around last offseason, you probably heard me talk about this guy as a potential replacement for Cam Akers. That didn't come to fruition last year, but it's coming to fruition in 2023, because not only is Cam Akers healthy and active, but it's also sounding like the Rams are actively trying to trade him. Sean McVay loves him some Kyren Williams, and it shows in the numbers from this past week. Now, he's got some tougher matchups coming up, and we'll see how that works out for him. But as of right now, he is the lead back. He's seeing touches on the ground. He's seeing touches through the air. In fact, I believe he only took like 3 offensive snaps off this past week. So not only is he the starter, but he is the guy. Now, he's probably still available in a lot of leagues out there because Cam Akers owners just weren't willing to jump ship and go for Kyren Williams right away. And other people out there weren't willing to go for Kyren Williams because they thought, Cam Akers is still the guy. Williams saw a couple lucky touchdowns, whatever. Was he picked up quite a bit? Absolutely. Were there a lot of people that potentially grabbed him after Cam Akers became an inactive very close to the start of game time this past week? Absolutely. But if for some reason he is still out there, this guy is definitely going to be the top priority ad in almost any type of league. For the New York Giants, we're going to have to talk about Matt Breida because at this point, it does look like Saquon Barkley may not only miss Thursday Night Football this week, but he could be in for a longer absence as well after hurting his ankle. Now, the good news is x-rays appear to be negative at this point. So we're looking at more along the lines of probably a pretty severe sprain, which could still take a couple of weeks before he could get back to action. Now, we're definitely not starting Matt Breida this week because the matchup doesn't warrant it. But in the next couple of weeks, depending on how long Saquon Barkley misses, we may be pushed into a situation where we have to start him anyway. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position. Another guy that I talked about last week and even told everybody at that point, Josh Reynolds, looks to be the number 2 target in this offense for the Detroit Lions right now. And he showed up with 2 touchdowns against Seattle in week 2. Now, until Jameson Williams comes back, Josh Reynolds is becoming a guy that we may have to look at starting. But not only that, we also are a little bit banged up for Detroit right now because Amon-Ra St. Brown had to leave the field more than a couple of times this past week being banged up. We lost David Montgomery, and Jahmyr Gibbs still really hasn't taken off in this offense. Jared Goff and Josh Reynolds played together in LA, if you don't remember that. They have a previous connection, and that connection is showing right now in Detroit. Josh Reynolds is becoming a guy that if you have 3 wide receiver spots, I would highly consider him in that 3rd wide receiver spot. Am I going to flex him over a running back? Maybe not. But also, if you're really hurting for wide receivers right now, as a wide receiver too, you probably could do a lot worse. Nelson Agholor was the unsung hero at the wide receiver position for Baltimore this week. OBJ ended up having to leave the game early. He had 5 more targets than Rashad Bateman had, and he had 1 more target than Zay Flowers and scored a touchdown. Is Nelson Agholor becoming a thing again? It really does feel like it. For those of you in deeper leagues, keep an eye on him. This offense, it's trying to open it up a little bit more and attack deep down the field. That's where Nelson Agholor makes his money. That's where he is good at. So keep an eye on him to continue to fit that role for these Baltimore Ravens. After week 1, Sky Moore was one of the most dropped players in fantasy football. And then he comes back with 4 targets, 3 receptions, 70 yards, and scores a touchdown. Now, I still don't think that we can bank on any one person outside of Travis Kelce being the guy in Kansas City. They're going to continue to spread the ball around everywhere. But Sky Moore and his big playability and the fact that Patrick Mahomes relied on him late this past week, I'm definitely on board with Sky Moore starting to bounce back and hopefully becoming at least the 1A, 1B in this offense. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with Jaden Reed when Christian Watson comes back. But after scoring 2 touchdowns this past week, Jaden Reed is a guy that's looking to stay on the field as much as possible. Now, if he can fit into the slot role, that's going to open up a healthy opportunity for him to stay on the field even when Watson's back. But Watson can't seem to stay healthy. Dobbs is a guy that, yeah, last week he did really well, then he kind of disappeared this week. Luke Musgrave is running a ton of routes, but not getting a ton of targets. So are we picking anybody in particular in this offense? Absolutely not. Nobody's really sticking out right now, unless your name is Aaron Jones and you didn't play this past week. So if we're taking shots at people, Jaden Reed is a guy that we also should be taking a shot at this week. Matt Collins had 6 targets and caught 3 of those for 60 receiving yards this past week. But he was honestly like that close to having a big touchdown grab, and then also just barely missed a ball on the sidelines as well. Matt Collins was super close to having a gigantic day for the Atlanta Falcons. And what makes even less sense than that is the fact that once again, Kyle Pitts did absolutely nothing. Now, the good news is Drake London bounced back. But Matt Collins, if he's really going to be the number 2 in this offense, then that means Kyle Pitts is basically done for, but that Matt Collins should be owned. Nico Collins had another huge week. Robert Woods saw a ton of targets again, and even Tank Dell got into the action a little bit this week. Now, Nico Collins is a definite priority add in all types of leagues right now. We talked about him this offseason and said if there was a guy that was going to take over as the wide receiver 1, it was definitely going to be Nico Collins. Now, when you take a look at the guys on the screen, Tank Dell's name is missing, and it's because I'm not running out to add Tank Dell right now. If you play in bigger leagues, like 14 or 16 team leagues, absolutely, take a shot at it. But Nico Collins is the number 1 wide receiver. And right now, Robert Woods is the number 2 for me. This guy has like 20 targets over the first 2 weeks of the season. And he's really being utilized by CJ Stroud as kind of that safety valve over the middle of the field and those high percentage completion plays. In PPR leagues, Robert Woods is going to mean a whole lot more than a guy like Tank Dell. So I'm going to prioritize adding him over Dell this week. Hunter Renfrow is a name that we're keeping an eye on because Jacoby Myers missed this past week in the concussion protocol, and then Devontae Adams had to leave the game early, also due to a concussion. If we end up finding out that neither of those guys can play in week 3, or maybe only Myers comes back and Adams misses, whatever it may be, Hunter Renfrow is going to take on a pretty big role and have quite a bit of targets coming his way. Now, everybody's talking about Puka Nacua from the Los Angeles Rams right now, and that makes sense because he is off to an absolutely historic start. But he's way too far owned now to be included in this video. But Tutu Atwell is flying under the radar right now. He's seeing a healthy amount of targets and he's performing well, while Van Jefferson has basically been forgotten about, and we're still a couple of weeks away from Cooper Kupp returning. At the least. Matthew Stafford is looking towards both of these guys. And now that defenses have saw 2 straight weeks of Puka Nacua, you got to imagine they're going to start game planning for them, which could leave Tutu Atwell for an opportunity for a bigger game. Well, it only took 6 quarters of football for the New York Giants to figure it out and stop looking like crap. And I don't love this matchup against San Francisco this coming week, but Darius Slayton is definitely a guy that is going to start seeing some increased value if the New York Jets are really figuring it out. Because Darius Slayton is the guy down the sideline, and he was a brilliant catch away from having a huge day this past week as well. I mean, I'm talking about literally just missing his left foot getting in at the 1-yard line. So for Darius Slayton, again, if this is a team that is starting to figure it out in the coming weeks, he's going to be the deep threat on this team, still over Jalen Hyatt right now. Continue to keep an eye on Darius Slayton. And for those of you in deeper leagues, guys like Jalen Hyatt, maybe even Isaiah Hodgins are going to be owned a little bit more than Darius Slayton. So for me, Darius Slayton is the guy that I'm keeping my eye on right now instead. Now, I have to include Marvin Mims in this video because if I don't, y'all are going to be yelling at me in the comments, and I don't want you yelling at me. But I'm not rushing out to add Marvin Mims right now because the simple fact is the dude only saw 3 targets and had 2 big plays. Are we going to be able to rely on that every single week? Now, the couple of weeks leading up to the season, we talked about Marvin Mims quite a bit because Jerry Jeudy was banged up. But now Jerry Jeudy is back, and hopefully over the next couple of games, he starts to look a little bit more healthy. You still have Cortland Sutton. We're still running the football. Marvin Mims is going to be a guy that, you know, he's going to get maybe 3-4 targets a week. He's not going to play a whole lot either. He's going to see a decreased snap percentage. So really at that point, if he's on the field for 50 or 60% of the offensive plays and only sees like maybe 3 or 4 targets a game, you're hoping for huge plays and big touchdowns every week. And I'm just not at the point where I'm willing to risk that. After a week where the media and tons of people went after Chase Claypool for what seemed like a lack of effort in his week 1 game for Chicago, apparently he was called out by teammates and the front office and told if you don't get your act together, you're definitely going to be a healthy scratch, and we're going to try and just get rid of you at this point. Chase Claypool ended up bouncing back with a touchdown grab this past week. But the biggest thing here is that Darnell Mooney is dealing with a potential knee injury. We're going to keep an eye on that. But if Mooney ends up missing time, then Chase Claypool is going to be right behind DJ Moore, and Cole Kmet is one of the main options in this offense. Once again, kind of like Marvin Mims though, we're probably relying on a big play a little bit too often, but if you're in a deeper league, it's probably worth a look. Devontae Parker was the one that led the team in receiving yards. Is he truly the #1 on this offense? Probably not. It's probably still Kendrick Bourne. But this is a team that the more wide receivers you have, the more the ball is going to be spread around. And Devontae Parker, especially in deeper leagues, is a guy to keep an eye on, even if he's not a guy that we're going to be starting right now. Now, as of this recording, Monday Night Football hasn't happened yet, but I'm adding Calvin Austin and Allen Robinson anyway. Keep an eye on the box score, keep an eye on routes ran, keep an eye on snaps, all of that good stuff. And then we'll try to decide if one of these guys is worth adding for next week. But we know George Pickens is banged up a little bit again. We know the Muth is banged up. We know Deontay Johnson's going to be missing a few weeks. One of these guys, I would assume, is going to be someone that we'll be talking about adding before week 3. All right, I know the tight end position is giving us a lot of fits right now, but there's actually a few guys on the waiver wire that I'm interested in taking a look at, and Dawson Knox is one of those guys. Now, he might be one of the riskiest options because his entire value is built on scoring touchdowns. Quite honestly, if the guy doesn't score, he's not going to get enough volume in yards. Dalton Kincaid is that guy. Dalton Kincaid is the guy, along with Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs, that's being looked at in between the 20s. But when we get to the red zone, Josh Allen clearly likes one guy the most out of everyone else, and that's Dawson Knox. He went to him multiple times this past week in the red zone. He had one touchdown and almost had a second. Dawson Knox is going to be a guy, once again, if you put him in your lineup and he doesn't score a touchdown, he might get you 2 or 3 points. But in those weeks where he's facing defenses that definitely allow touchdowns to the tight end position, he's going to be worth taking a look at. Kylen Granson saw his first receiving touchdown of his career this weekend, and even though it wasn't Anthony Richardson, it was Gardner Minshew that threw it, I know that Richardson loves looking Granson's way when he's on the field. Now, Richardson is in the concussion protocol as of this recording, so we'll have to keep an eye on whether or not he makes it back for this week. But Granson is going to be a guy anywhere from 0 to 10 yards past the line of scrimmage, because that's where Indianapolis is currently working in their offense, is going to see a decent amount of targets, and he's going to have some touchdown potential every week. Zach Ertz saw another 8 targets after seeing 10 in week 1, and his overall numbers looked a lot better in this week as well. He's working his way back from that knee injury, but it's clear that Josh Dobbs loves looking towards Zach Ertz, and in any type of a matchup where they're going to be playing from behind, Ertz is going to see plenty of target. Now, is he going to have the same upside as some of the other tight ends? Absolutely not. But if we're seeing 8 to 10 targets a week for this guy, he definitely becomes somebody that I'm willing to throw in just because I know he's not going to put up a goose egg for me. Tyler Conklin saw 6 targets this past week, and as long as Zach Wilson is the starter, Tyler Conklin is going to be a guy to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks. Again, not a ton of upside, but it's very possible that he becomes the #2 target in this offense, given the fact that him and Zach Wilson have a history together, and Allen Lazard was brought in to work with Aaron Rodgers. He doesn't have that chemistry with Zach Wilson. Tyler Conklin could quickly become the #2 in this offense. Unfortunately, Logan Thomas is in the concussion protocol right now, but I mentioned it during my waiver wire video last week. If Sam Howell was going to give targets to Logan Thomas, we absolutely had to keep him in mind at the tight end position. And he saw a couple of targets and a touchdown before going out this past week due to that nasty hit. But going forward, if he's like the #2 for Sam Howell, again, we're looking at a guy that if he gives us 6 to 8 targets a week and has some red zone upside, he's someone that we're going to have to consider playing. How about Hunter Henry, still under 50% owned in most leagues? This guy is a top 5 tight end right now, 2 touchdowns in the first 2 weeks, and I told you all off-season long, Hunter Henry was a guy that had top 12 potential, and if you needed a tight end late, Hunter Henry was the guy. I know it's only week 2. I don't want to take victory laps right now, but the tight end whisperer is working his magic once again. All right, let's look at a couple of options that we could stream at the quarterback position, and the guys I'm taking a look at this week are Baker Mayfield and Sam Howell. Baker Mayfield has done very well the first 2 weeks. And now he gets a Philadelphia defense that has been absolutely shredded by Mac Jones and Kirk Cousins. Baker Mayfield may not have quarterback 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 upside, but if you're looking to stream somebody this week, especially if you're somebody that owned like Anthony Richardson, Baker Mayfield is a guy that does have low-end quarterback 1 potential in this matchup. Now, Sam Howell's matchup on paper against Buffalo may not look great, but this is a guy that just played very, very well on the road against a good Denver defense as well. Sam Howell is absolutely a streaming option for us this week, and maybe he doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world, but definitely the guy is a top quarterback 2 option with a little bit of quarterback 1 upside sprinkled in. There's really only 2 defenses that I'm taking a look at this week that have decent matchups and have an ownership percentage low enough that you could probably still get them. And I hate doing this to my Detroit Lions, but based on the way they look this past week and how many injuries that they've had, Ross St. Brown is banged up. I talked about this earlier in the show. It feels like the entire Lions team got banged up. Plus, they might be missing 2 of their offensive linemen this coming weekend. That right there alone gives Atlanta the potential that if they can cause a couple of turnovers, they're absolutely going to be a team that could help stop Detroit a little bit, especially if they're not healthy. Now, it definitely has a lot of risk involved with it, but still keep an eye on it. Jacksonville held Indianapolis to 21 points in week 1, and then the Kansas City Chiefs to only 17 points in week 2. Now they're going to be getting a younger, kind of banged up Houston Texans offense that they would also be able to probably dominate a little bit up front, potentially cause some turnovers and make life hard. Unless you have them in your fantasy lineup, then your life might be just fine. All right, let's quickly touch on a few players that we could potentially drop. And I'm going to talk about some running backs that just aren't getting the looks after a couple of weeks. And Zach Charbonnet is going to lead the list here. This is a guy that is being completely outsnapped and outplayed by Kenneth Walker, which isn't a huge surprise. As we talked about this offseason, Charbonnet definitely had some potential and definitely could find himself in maybe like a 60-40 split. But Kenneth Walker was not going to go away, and Kenneth Walker could still put up some very good numbers, and we shouldn't be, skimming over Kenneth Walker in our draft just because of Zach Charbonnet. Well, through the first couple of weeks of the season, Charbonnet isn't doing anything. So if you are a Kenneth Walker owner and you're holding on to Charbonnet because if there's an injury you could start him, that's fine. But if you've been holding on to Charbonnet because you think you could start him along with Kenneth Walker, that's just not happening. It's clear Rashad Penny is just depth at this point for the Philadelphia Eagles. And maybe at some point this season, he becomes a guy that we add because nobody else is healthy. But Kenneth Gainwell is getting touches over him. DeAndre Swift dominated this past week. Boston Scott played more than what Rashad Penny did. And Rashad Penny was a healthy scratch in week 1. Rashad Penny should just be on waivers now. Now, I had a thought in my start and sit video for running backs that Jerick McKinnon could be a guy that sees a little bit of a bounce back in week 2 just because of how heavily he was utilized down the stretch in 2022. And because the wide receivers had so many issues for Kansas City, Jerick McKinnon might be in favor of Patrick Mahomes this week because Mahomes needed somebody to trust outside of Travis Kelce. Well, that just didn't happen as the ball was spread all over the place and Jerick McKinnon wasn't even really included in that conversation. So for me, Jerick McKinnon right now is definitely a guy that I'm moving on from. Isaiah Pacheco hasn't shown a ton of upside and CEH was a scratch this past week, but we'll end up seeing what happens in the coming weeks, even if it doesn't include Jerick McKinnon in that game plan. This is now the second straight week that I've tried to convey to everybody that if you're listening to Tank Bigsby truthers out there trying to tell you how good he is and that he was going to replace Travis Etienne and all these other things, that you were listening to people lie to you the entire time about him. So much so that D'Ernest Johnson saw more touches than what Tank Bigsby did this week. Tank Bigsby didn't have any carries on the ground, and he had no targets through the air. Bigsby is a guy that is not valuable unless Travis Etienne were to miss time. If you want to hold on to him as a Travis Etienne owner, just in case, that's fine. But just like with Zach Charbonnet, I am not interested in Tank Bigsby in any way, shape, or form unless Travis Etienne is injured. As long as Mike Williams continues to stay healthy, Quentin Johnson is going to continue to see really no involvement in the passing game. Josh Palmer continues to be out there, and they're running a lot of 2 tight end sets. Darnold Parham and Gerald Everett both getting looks as well right now. Unfortunately, Quentin Johnson just doesn't have a role in this offense unless Mike Williams were to go down with an injury. And at the tight end position, Dalton Schultz is a guy that I'm just not interested in owning anymore right now. The role that we thought Dalton Schultz could have is actually being occupied by Robert Woods right now. The good thing about Dalton Schultz is that if you want to drop him and take a shot at a tight end that has a little bit more upside, it's fine because no one's really going to run to add Dalton Schultz. He'll probably still be available if you wanted to pick him up again next week or something like that. But for me, I'm moving forward without Schultz right now. Yo, Headliner Nation, there you have it. My waiver wire video for week 3 of the NFL season. There's definitely a few guys that you should be taking a shot at before you set lineups for week 3. Make sure you hit that like button for me. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel as well. But listen, in the comment section, if there's a guy that I didn't talk about, if there's a guy in the drop section that I didn't talk about, if there's a move that you're looking to make, leave it in the comments. And just like the last 2 weeks, I'll try to answer as many as I can to help you figure out who you should be prioritizing. But for now, I'm going to get out of here, Headliner Nation. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.